Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, students. We are now going to take a look at qualitative data analysis. That can sound a little scary at first, right? But we've been going through this class, and I'm sure you're ready for the challenge. So once you have collected your qualitative data through field research, such as participant observations, as we talked about, or qualitative interviews, or focus group, it's time to code your data and search for patterns, right? This is a lengthy process given to you likely have hours and hours of data to explore. Now, qualitative analysis is the non-numeric interpretation of observations to discover meanings and patterns related to your research questions. So what types of patterns do we typically discover? Well, we're going to talk about that. So what type of patterns do we typically discover? For social researchers, right? Well, we look for frequencies of information across observations we make. What stands out, what appears to happen often, the magnitude is also important, what levels are apparent, right? How much do people really like or dislike sushi from our example? What structures can be defined, such as different types of categories or what ordering or processes take place? And then, of course, looking for causes and consequences based on your social issue or topic, right? To search for patterns, we usually use cross-case analysis, right? Cross-case analysis ends up being very important towards our total understanding. So let me move myself right here. Look, I got an exclamation mark above my head. I'm a quest. Click me for a quest. Sorry, I couldn't resist, right? But we do this in this example of this cross-case analysis. This is, we look for patterns across the various observations we make. We can do this in two general ways. Variable orientation analysis is when we search for patterns among the variables we have defined. The case or people usually that we have interviewed and or observed have these variables such as gender, age, and attitudes about sushi, right? How old were you when you had it? What do you think about it? Right? Are you male-bodied, female-bodied? How do you identify? Yet the attitudes and gender and age themselves are when we are focusing to find the patterns, right? This is more similar to a nomoethic approach, where we may not want to go into detail about each person, but rather we are focused on explaining the variables in question. Now, the next way that we can do this, right, is kind of tying to this idea of the case-oriented analysis, right? This approach is more along the lines of idiographic. We aim to understand all the details about a particular case, or the whole background and the story of one person we interview and observe. When creating or analyzing a theory based on meaning found in sociological patterns, though, we can't rely on one person's life. So instead, we may dive extremely deeply or deeply into several cases from an overall cross-case analysis. Now, let's pause to answer this question that you're about to see on your screen. So I'm making myself here. Look, it is me, right? It's on your screen. Here's the question. Which of the following answer choices is an inductive approach to research in which theories are generated solely from an examination of the data rather than being derived deductively? Is it A, cross-case analysis, B, grounded theory method, C, constant comparative method, or D, monitoring method studies? Make sure to pause and think, and then resume the video when you're ready to hear the answer. So, you took a guess, hopefully you're correct, but the correct answer to this choice was, in fact, B, grounded theory method, or GTM, which we have covered in the past previous weeks as inductive approach. Observations are used to create theory, rather than starting with theory. Generating hypotheses and testing them with data is done in a deductive approach. GTM, or grounded theory method, ideally starts with no preconceptions and explores data to discover patterns that then lead to creating theory based on the observation itself. To do this, Glasser and Strauss, the sociologists who developed the method in 1960, came up with 4 stages: constant comparison, comparative method, right? Where observations are compared to one another as theory views, right? Let me say that again, just so you can hear it again. Where observations are compared to one another as the theory evolves, or views evolves, right? Comparing incidents across cases or people. They research the frequency, the magnitudes that occur, and create categories and dimensions, much like conceptualizing constructs, integrating categories and properties of them. Once the categories or concepts are defined, take note of the relationships between them. Then, as patterns become clear, yet rigid or irrelevant information and hone in on one of the most essential or the relationships noticed. Then finally, write up theory, describe the findings and the patterns, right? So this becomes really big when we think about how we go down this path. This is what we were just talking about with grounded theory method or GTM. And now we're going to talk about semiotics, right? Now, semiotics, the study of signs and the meanings associated with them, or the science of signs, essentially ties to this idea that we're going to be talking about. These are other approaches to analyze the qualitative data. And semiotics, which is the science of signs, as it says, here we are looking through the content to code based on the said signs, which are anything that holds a particular meaning that is agreed upon. I'm an interactionalist constructionalist, so I really love the study of micro in science. So it really ties to this idea. So underlying context is the qualitative data may be explored through semiotics, and it can also be explored through conversation and conversation analysis, which scrutinizes the way we talk with each other. If you're familiar with hypomorphosis hypothesis, that's a big one, right? If you can't explain something, it's hard to understand that it exists, right? This can be including pauses, tones and inflection, what we are actually saying to each other, and how does the structure of a conversation change depending on whom or who we are talking to and what we are talking about, right? We're really excited, our voice changes. We're really bored, our voice goes down, right? I had a professor once in community college when I was first getting going inside academia, whose entire syllabus had a point where if you fell asleep in class, you got an F. There was a reason this was on here. He had a monotone French accent, and I joke with you not, many people failed. So it matters how we say things, right? No matter what analytic approach we take, qualitative analysis requires that we process or code the data into meaningful ways to understand and retrieve it. We can't simply have hours of audio recordings of interviews or pages and pages of written field notes in various orders. We must meticulously comb through and classify the data to find important, relevant information that emerges. Like what I mentioned with the company that I was working for, so much of their solutions was literally on the page. No one looked. If we were to do this manually without computer assistance, such as SPSS, we could have stacks of folders of each of our codes. So let's say we have several observations of variable risk-taking behavior. Every time we find an example that in our field notes we place in the risk-taking folder, we might need several copies of that example, as it might include information important to explaining gender patterns as well. And we need to take place the experiment into two folders, one for each code. We can easily create folders, copy and paste and highlight and comments and etc. using computers now, instead of having printed copies of pages and materials. Yet when thinking about coding, we want to physically locate the information that goes with our codes, right? So as we're talking about, we have to be clever. We have to create codes. And going further than just manually analyzing our data, today many researchers rely on various qualitative data analysis programs, which Babby details in the chapter on qualitative analysis. You will not be tested on the specifics of each of these programs, yet know that they exist and are useful for coding and, more importantly, more relatively easily retrieving all the information assigned to a code. Now, when I worked in market research, right, we used SPSS, which is the gold standard. And I can tell you that hours and hours and hours and hours of data, time was simplified because it was procedural, processual. You know, you're having a computer be able to be given the variables. We're in a time right now, ChatGPT, where we're seeing a lot of this actually structured differently now. My brother works in data analytics, and he runs a research firm and a company that does analysis for people. And ChatGPT is changing his life, right? Because the reality is that the better our technology gets, the more realistic it is for us to be able to streamline this process and maybe remove some inundated steps, right? But how do we come up with these codes? Let the research, question, and observations of patterns lead the way. You don't need to reinvent the wheel. Open coding involves the initial classification that make based on our first labels and of the observation. These are more obvious descriptions at the start, and we may identify a lot of codes at this point. Axial coding takes a reanalysis where we look up the coding results and regroup the data based on relationships across the open codes. And selective coding is when we narrow down the central concept or concepts that become clear throughout the analysis. And though this whole process of coding the data is very important to conducting memoing, right? Which is to write memos about what you are finding along the way. So make sure you're always memoing because you need to have an idea of why this stuck out to you, right? Essential memos call out the concept definitions, ideas of the theoretical assumptions, and how the data is collected and processed. These are notes for yourself to refer to later for writing up your analysis. Code notes include your definitions of meanings, the labels you're giving each of your codes. Theoretical notes may include relationships between concepts, reflections on underlying contexts that appear, and any deeper meaning in the data that are standing out to you, particularly you, right? And operational notes or memos about the methodological process. Any issues that come up along the data collection should be noted here. Write down your memos as soon as they come up, right? As soon as they come up to you, just so that you know what to do with them in your jottings in the field. Do not rely on your memory, as we talked about, as you may forget significant reflections once you move to analyzing another section of the field notes, right? So it becomes important to know this. So there are, of course, ethical concerns to keep in the forefront of a researcher's analysis. The subjectivity of the qualitative data collection and analysis means the researcher must avoid bias when interpreting the data. Weber says that we should seek bias-free, but it's almost impossible, right? It's very important that we have Verstehen, but we have to constantly check ourselves at the door. Implicit biases are dangerous because we may not even know that we're doing them, right? The data must be clearly defined, explained, and rely on credible coding. Searching through the data simply and finding information that supports what you want it to say would not fit the code of ethics in social research. So if the researcher must do their part to objectively analyze and report the patterns that emerge, even if it does not fit with their assumptions. Remember the old joke, to assume makes an ass out of you and me, right? Dad joke, nailed it. But you just look at the spelling of it. And of course, we analyze qualitative data. It is imperative to take precautions to keep information confidential. The privacy and identities of each participant must be protected. So removing any names and identifiers from the data before reporting the analysis is essential. And I just wanted to say this again. I said it before in a few other lectures. I've worked for some companies that have asked for me to do some unethical things. It came to me, myself, and I, and the company to decide not to take that paycheck and to refuse to do so. Because when your back's against the wall, you'll find out if you're ready and you're really about it. Because when you're doing a 7-point Likert scale in satisfaction to a major company, this is a personal example, and they ask you to change it to a 6-point Likert scale so that they can appear better, they'll offer a lot of zeros at the end of that check. But data doesn't lie, people do. So make sure that you're always being ethical and protect your participants because they're giving you this information. They're the ones who are opening up to answering your qualitative analysis. Ethics matter. We've talked a lot about that in this class. I'll see you next lecture. Ciao.